Today marks 1 year since the deadly fire destroyed the Usindiso Building in Marshalltown, Johannesburg, killing 76 people and leaving hundreds homeless. The five-story building was later found to be one of the many hijacked buildings in the Johannesburg inner city. Let's bring in Osmond Mngomezulu now, a lawyer for the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. Mr. Mngomezulu, thank you very much indeed for your time. We really do appreciate it. You know, a bit earlier on, I was speaking to my colleague Hasina Gori, and I asked her what the conditions are, the living conditions are, where those, who were survivors of that fire had been relocated to. What are the current living conditions, according to your knowledge?
Well, thank you for inviting us. The living conditions are appalling. Not long ago, I would say 3 weeks ago, we went with Justice Kambebe to conduct an inspection at Denver, TA, the informal settlements, where some of the survivors have been placed. We found that it's less than 20 of the Usindiso survivors who were moved to Denver. The others were deported, arrested and deported soon after the fire, when they were still mourning the losses of their loss of their loved ones. Others have been displaced, have no places to live, and others have reoccupied some of the bad buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg. But those that we met at Denver, a temporary emergency accommodation, the word itself says temporary emergency accommodation. It's a year now since they were placed there. The shacks are deteriorating. There's flooding during the rain. The land appears to be dolomitic because we are told that there is illegal mining happening underground, where there's blasting and vibrations that are heard by the community. So what we found there when we were inspecting with the judge was heartbreaking. And we were also informed that the children who may have attended school in town are unable to attend school in the Denver area because either the schools are full or they are also far. They would require transport to be taken to schools. So we found young children of school-going age playing because there's just no school to go to.
Yeah. I mean, these are really sad conditions, that I'm told that these are both foreign nationals as well as South Africans that are part of this contingent. My colleague Hasina Gori was telling me a bit earlier on, but one of the recommendations by the Commission was the process of demolishing the Usindiso building, and basically implement some of these recommendations that have been made. Do we know what is the status of the building currently?
Well, it was a recommendation before the final report that the building be demolished. But SERI made submissions that it would be premature for the building to be demolished because a proper structural assessment would have to be conducted in order to determine whether or not it must be demolished or revamped to mitigate the housing crisis in the inner city. The Commission, in its final report, noted that those processes are underway for a thorough, comprehensive structural assessment to be conducted, and then after which a decision will be made. But it had accepted prima facie the preliminary report of the structural engineer who went to the property a day or two after the fire, who had found that the structure had been compromised and the building had to be demolished. But we were also informed by some of the survivors, and we were given video footage of the building being stripped down of material by those who may be seeking to gain some steel material to
that's often
to
what
sell.
happens, indeed.
So
yes.
In any event, when that final assessment is conducted, it will be a little too late, because the structural integrity continues to be undermined by it being stripped of any salvageable material.
So that particular building, it ticked a number of boxes of non-compliance, by the city of Johannesburg, which failed to basically implement its bylaws. Just remind us, what building regulations were not followed? And do we see an escalation of this in the Johannesburg CBD? And the reason why I ask this is because last I recalled, there'd been over 100 hijacked buildings in the Johannesburg CBD, if my memory serves me well, and there's just simply no compliance. Last weekend, we had another fire in the Johannesburg CBD of a hijacked building as well. So this is a consistent problem, and it simply isn't going anywhere.
Indeed. The Commission looked at Usindiso in twofold. Both the city as the owner of the property and the city as the local government that is mandated to enforce legislation and the bylaws. So there were duties of the owner that the city had not complied with. The owner must ensure that the building is fitted with the fire safety equipment. The building is legally connected to services. There's waste removal, all of those obligations that are imposed on the owner, which are imposed on any other owner of a property in the inner city, in the city of Johannesburg. So those had not been complied with because the Johannesburg Property Company had abandoned the property at least since 2019, and therefore failed to discharge any obligations that an owner is required to discharge. But the city also failed to enforce its own bylaws, the building control standards, the building legislation, the public health bylaws, electricity bylaws, waste management bylaws, and the fire safety bylaws, which is the emergency management services bylaws. All of those had not been complied with because the city is tasked with enforcing compliance with these bylaws. And at Usindiso and possibly many other properties that are unlawfully occupied, you find that these bylaws are not complied with. And it is for that reason that the Commission, in its recommendations, recommended that the accounting officers of the city's entities, including the JPC, Joburg Water, Pick It Up, and City Power, steps had to be taken to enforce some disciplinary action, to investigate whether or not, if they had performed their obligations, the calamity would have been avoided.
So has anyone been held to account for that fire as we speak?
To our knowledge, not. To our knowledge, not. We are firmly participating in the Commission. We submit, the city submits things that must be considered by the Commission. We make our own submissions. We've not received any submissions relating to the implementation of that report. The last time we had issues of implementation were when the Premier, or during the launch of the report, where the Premier said a task team will be established to ensure the implementation. But 3 months later, after the report, we've not received any information that even one person has been held accountable.
You also highlighted that there should be no finding of responsibility in respect of the residents, and that their conduct be understood in the context of the city's own failure to address their living conditions. Just share reasons why you believe so.
Well, if you read the report, it's a recommendation that had been made by SERI. And the commission says SERI submitted that the residents must not be blamed for their own deaths and injuries. We agree. It accepts that recommendation that the occupiers, it was established that the fire started on the ground floor. The people who died, who were on the 3rd floor, 4th floor, 2nd floor, people were sleeping when the fire started. So it would be irresponsible to blame people for their own deaths and their injuries that they have not caused. There are witnesses who testified before the commission who are labeled as Mr. X and Miss Y, who made allegations around burning a body and the like. Those, we understand, are being dealt with through the criminal justice system. And we recommended that those must be taken further through the appropriate channels, which is the criminal justice system. But the residents of the inner city, who are largely poor and lack secure tenure, cannot be criminalized and blamed for their for the poverty under which they live. It is a known fact that SERI represents hundreds, if not thousands, of occupiers of similarly placed buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg. These are people who have no means to find accommodation on their own. We've litigated, courts have compelled the city of Johannesburg to conduct an occupancy audit. Those have been conducted, and it will be established that the occupiers cannot afford alternative accommodation, and the city must provide them with suitable alternative accommodation, which is provided through what they call temporary emergency accommodation. And currently, the city says it has no funds to provide temporary emergency accommodation. So you find that despite the court orders, there are people who continue to occupy unsafe buildings because the city is just unable to move them to suitable alternative accommodation. The survivors of the fire that took place last week are at a sports field in tents where 10 people who are not related are sharing one small tent, and there are sponges where they sleep. There's no privacy. And when the rainy season starts, one can only imagine what's going to happen, because that place appears to be prone to flooding. And so that's the kind of accommodation that is then provided. You find that others who are unable to bear their living conditions find a way to reoccupy another unsafe building. So it becomes a vicious cycle where the problem is not really addressed. But there are laws, Griselda, that were adopted. The National Housing Code many years ago. It has the emergency housing program. That emergency housing program provides for funding to be made available in emergencies, which include evictions. So based on the submissions that we are making to the Commission of Inquiry, is that the city is not utilizing that that avenue to obtain funding to deal with this crisis.
So we're going to continue to see instances where we'll be having this discussion again about, residents perishing in these hijacked buildings. And I say this on the premise that just last weekend, we had another fire which could have otherwise turned out into something else. And more buildings every week, every month are being hijacked in the Johannesburg CBD. And the provincial government is aware of this. But you simply have recommendations from reports such as this one at the Usindiso Building, which are simply not being implemented. Osmond Mngomezulu, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.